What would you do if, after months of fearing death, you walked out of a hospital alive and realized the person holding your hand had already become the home you were too afraid to believe you deserved? For days, Tu Tien had lived as if a sentence had already been written over her life. Every dizziness, every sleepless night, every trembling spell brought back the same terror, that the illness she feared was quietly taking her away from the man who had loved her through every storm. In the cold hallway of a major hospital in Hanoi, under merciless white lights, she waited for the truth while her heart prepared for the worst. But love sometimes arrives not by removing pain immediately, but by refusing to let a frightened soul face it alone. Jack sat beside her, saying little, holding her hand as though his silence could steady the part of her that had nearly collapsed. And when the doctor finally spoke, the future shifted in an instant. The feared diagnosis was not real. She was not dying. She was wounded, weakened, haunted by trauma, but still alive, still reachable, still standing on the side of life. What followed was not just relief, it was a return to breath, to hope, to tenderness, and to a love that would soon ask not merely to survive, but to last a lifetime. The hospital hallway seemed built to strip emotion bare. Its white walls reflected too much light. The air smelled of antiseptic and exhaustion. Every sound arrived with unnatural sharpness, the squeak of shoes, the rustle of papers, the low murmur of nurses moving from one room to another. In that corridor, where so many families waited between fear and truth, Tu Tien sat with both hands clasped tightly in her lap, trying to control the trembling that kept returning to her body in quiet waves. The past weeks had hollowed her out. Ever since she had wandered, frightened and disoriented through the forest, her health had never truly settled. Her body had weakened. Her sensitivity to the weather had become severe. Sudden changes in air and temperature left her drained, breathless, and frightened by the sharpness of her own physical reactions. But what tormented her even more than the symptoms was the thought attached to them, the fear of something terminal, something final, something that would take her away before she had even fully learned how to live without fear. Beside her, Jack sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. He said very little because he understood that some forms of panic become worse when they are overhandled. Instead, he held her hand. His grip was firm but never restrictive. It was the grip of a man trying to tell someone, without saying it aloud, that even if the world split open in the next few minutes, she would not fall through it alone. When the doctor finally emerged with the results, Tu Tien rose too quickly, as if her whole body had been waiting on instinct rather than strength. The doctor's voice was calm, measured, professional. There was no dramatic pause, no theatrical buildup, just the truth delivered with steady clarity. She was not suffering from leukemia. The feared illness, the one that had haunted her thoughts, poisoned her sleep, and turned every weakness into a possible ending, was not there. What she was facing was physical depletion, intensified by psychological trauma and a severe reaction to weather changes. Serious, yes. Painful, yes. But not the death sentence she had already begun mourning inside herself. For one suspended second, Tu Tien could not understand what she had heard. Then relief hit her with almost violent force. Her knees weakened, tears burst from her eyes before she even realized she was crying. Her whole body shook, not with fear this time, but with the release of it. It was as if the darkness she had been carrying in silence suddenly lost its authority. Jack caught her before she fully crumpled into the moment, pulling her into a tight embrace right there in the hospital corridor. She laughed and sobbed at once. So did he. The sound echoed strangely against the white walls, too intimate for such a sterile place, and yet absolutely real. There was nothing graceful about that relief. It came out raw and full, like a person finally allowed to breathe after holding air in her chest for far too long. Jack pressed his face against her hair. And though he had spent days trying to stay strong for her sake, the emotion in him had long ago passed the point of neat control. When they left the hospital hand in hand, the city outside looked transformed. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The trees seemed greener. The air, though still carrying the heaviness of Hanoi's traffic and heat, no longer felt hostile. The sky had not suddenly become more beautiful. It was simply that fear had stopped dimming it. Tu Tien walked slowly, as though relearning how to occupy her own body without the constant shadow of catastrophe. Jack did not hurry her. He looked at her often on the way home, searching not for symptoms anymore, but for signs of returning softness. A clearer breath, a steadier step, the look in her eyes when she turned toward him without dread. Back in their small, cozy home, something in him changed from fear into devotion. He would not let her do anything that day. She barely had time to sit before he was already moving through the kitchen with the determined clumsiness of a man who had made up his mind to care for someone and was willing to be imperfect in the process. He flipped through old cookbook pages, frowned at measurements, opened jars, checked ingredients, and brewed ginger tea with such seriousness that Tu Tien could not help but smile through the tears still drying on her face. The kitchen slowly filled with the smell of warm food and ginger. It was not elegant cooking. It was not the work of a practiced hand, but that made it more moving, not less. Jack was not trying to impress her. He was trying to nourish her, to rebuild through ordinary tenderness what fear had weakened inside her. Every movement said the same thing. You are here. You are safe. Let me take care of you now. Tu Tien sat watching him and felt her heart grow too full for silence. Only hours earlier, she had been bracing for the possibility that her life might be quietly ending. Now, she was watching the man who had carried her fear with her stand in their kitchen, feeding a stove flame, checking broth, bringing her tea, and building peace from ingredients and love. Tears came again. But these were no longer the tears of terror. They were the tears that come when pain withdraws and leaves tenderness suddenly exposed. When he finally brought the food to her, he sat beside her and fed her small bites, watching her with the kind of joy that made his own eyes shine. They laughed between mouthfuls. She leaned into him. He kissed her forehead. The room seemed to glow, not because of anything expensive or grand, but because relief had made every simple thing radiant. Tu Tien understood then that love had not only accompanied her through fear, it had actively held her together inside it. The next morning, Jack woke with a secret. There was a strange brightness in him, one that Tu Tien noticed at once. He led her outside before fully explaining anything, and there, waiting near the gate, stood a bicycle. The training wheels were gone. She stopped walking immediately. There was laughter in her voice when she asked what he was doing, but also nervousness. She had not expected this. The bicycle looked ordinary enough, but in that moment it represented something larger than balance and movement. It represented recovery, trust, forward motion. A body once ruled by fear, learning to move toward life again. Jack placed both hands lightly on the handlebars and told her, with a smile too warm to resist, that today she would ride with him. At first, she was unsure, her grip tense, her movements cautious. But he stayed beside her with patient steadiness. He did not tease her when she wobbled. He did not push too hard or too fast. He guided the bicycle step by step along the path, his voice low and reassuring, his presence turning nervousness into something almost playful. The wind moved softly through her hair as they rode. The road stretched toward the new farm Jack had been quietly working on over many hidden days. Tu Tien did not know that yet. She only knew that every meter forward felt strangely symbolic, as if her body were remembering something her heart had nearly forgotten: how to trust movement, how to lean into uncertainty without expecting disaster. Jack glanced back now and then, his eyes full of the kind of tenderness that makes guidance feel like partnership rather than control. By the time the farm came into view, her fear had changed. It had not vanished completely, but it no longer ruled the moment. Curiosity rose in its place. What she saw when they arrived made her stop breathing for a second. The farm had been transformed. A wooden hut stood there like something half real and half remembered from a dream. Soft lights had been arranged around it, not excessively, but enough to make the space glow with quiet intention. A rose garden bloomed in deep red around the clearing, the petals lifting gently in the breeze like small flames of feeling. Nothing about the place was loud. That was what made it so beautiful. It was not built to impress strangers. It was built to hold one truth clearly. This had all been prepared for her. Jack led her further in. His hand trembled slightly inside hers, and that alone told her what his face had not yet said. He brought her into the wooden hut, where the lights softened around them, and the outside world seemed to move farther away. Then he turned toward her, and in his hand was a ring, real gold, not an empty gesture, not a mistaken symbol from some broken misunderstanding in the past, but something chosen carefully and offered now with clarity. Tu Tien felt the world around her blur, the roses, the lights, the wood, the late afternoon air, everything seemed to gather around the center of the moment and wait. Then Jack knelt. There was nothing theatrical in the way he did it. If anything, the gesture carried more humility than performance. His voice, when he began to speak, was deep and warm, but threaded with emotion. He told her he still remembered their beginning, the strange path that led them from a cave encounter into a shared life neither of them could have predicted. He remembered the misunderstandings, the losses, the humiliations, the illness, the nights of worry, the times they had nearly been broken, and the times they had chosen each other anyway. He spoke of the last 2 years not as a perfect love story, but as a hard-earned one, a real one made stronger not because it was untouched by pain, but because it had survived it. He told her that through everything, she had become the most important person in his life, not in a decorative romantic sense, but in the deepest, most practical way. She had become the person whose happiness affected the whole shape of his days, the person whose pain shook him, the person whose presence made even suffering bearable. Then he looked at her with a steadiness that reached past fear and straight into devotion, and said he wanted to care for her for the rest of this lifetime. The proposal was simple. That was why it was overwhelming. No orchestra, no crowd, no polished performance, only a wooden hut, roses, dusk, and a man kneeling before the woman he loved, with a ring in trembling hands and a lifetime in his voice. Tu Tien stood frozen, her heart pounding as memory after memory rose through her all at once. The cave, the hardship, the fear of illness, the way he had stood beside her in the hospital, the way he had cooked for her with clumsy tenderness, the bicycle, the farm, the roses. Every piece of their journey seemed to gather inside her and become one answer. Tears ran down her cheeks before she could stop them. For so long she had carried quiet feelings of unworthiness, old insecurities tied to who she had once been, to the wandering emptiness of a life before home, before safety, before being fully claimed by love. But in that moment, those old wounds loosened their grip. Jack was not asking out of pity. He was not rescuing her. He was choosing her, wholly, clearly, and with full knowledge of the road they had already walked. When she said yes, the word came through tears and breath and trembling joy. Jack stood, slid the ring onto her finger, and pulled her into his arms. She held him just as tightly, as though all the pain of the past had finally reached the point where it could dissolve. It did not mean they had never suffered. It meant the suffering no longer had the final word. Dusk settled fully over the farm then, warm and gold and almost unreal in its beauty. They stood among the roses with the certainty that home is not always a place first. Sometimes it is a person. Sometimes it is the moment you stop apologizing for needing love and begin receiving it with both hands. But the day was not over. Jack had one more tenderness prepared, and this one reached beyond the two of them. Later, around a bonfire at the farm, the atmosphere changed from sacred intimacy into warm family celebration. Mother Luddy was there, so was Uncle Doom. The fire cracked gently as bamboo sticky rice cooked and grilled meat sent its smoke upward into the darkening sky. The light from the flames touched every face differently, but on each one it revealed relief. Jack and Tu Tien exchanged a glance before gently turning their attention toward the two older hearts in front of them. With warmth, teasing, and quiet hope, they did what younger people in loving families sometimes long to do. They tried to bring two lonely adults closer together, not with force, not with embarrassment, but with affection. They wanted Mother Luddy to have happiness too. They wanted her later years not to be defined only by sacrifice and worry. They wanted Uncle Doom, who had stood with kindness and steadiness, to become not a guest in their family, but part of its future. The laughter that followed around the fire felt cleansing. No one was pretending life had been easy. They all knew too much for that. But there are evenings when gratitude arrives so strongly that it softens every face at once. Tu Tien leaned her head against Jack's shoulder and watched the flames while the older pair slowly relaxed into the warmth of being gently matched, gently included, gently seen. This was not just a celebration of an engagement. It was the restoration of a family's ability to hope. By the time the fire burned lower, the atmosphere around it had become almost dreamlike. Smoke rising into the night, bamboo rice open steaming, meat passed hand to hand, small jokes, soft laughter, familiar eyes shining in orange light. No one needed grand speeches anymore. They had already lived through too much for words to matter more than presence. Tu Tien sat there and understood the shape of her life differently now, not as a frightened girl who had once been lost in the forest, not as someone waiting for tragedy to name her, but as a woman who had walked through fear, illness, confusion, love, and healing, and had arrived at a firelit evening surrounded by the people who had become her true home. And perhaps that is the emotional truth this story leaves behind. Sometimes happiness does not come in a single miracle. It comes in layers. First, the terror is lifted. Then the body is cared for. Then trust is rebuilt. Then the road begins to move again. Then love kneels before you and asks to stay forever. And finally, around a small fire with the people who matter most, you realize that what you were really fighting for all along was not simply survival, it was belonging. It was a life in which fear no longer ruled the future, in which love proved itself through actions, and in which even wounded people could still build something warm enough to call a family.